Tracy.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm afraid I don't have an amazing slide show tonight. I simply haven't had time, but then I went through my presentation and thought there aren't actually any slides I could use, to tell you the truth. And you'll realize why as you listen to the paper, which hopefully you won't find too boring because you've not got anything to look at except just me. So sorry about that. But it's Emily Bronte, the man Branwell should have been. And this is something I actually began thinking about a million years ago when I did my master's. I did a Bronte's module, and that's when I first became interested in masculinity. So here we go. Masculinity and femininity, as anybody has listened to me umpteen times will know, has no biological reality. Gender critics prefer to see them as metaphors through which identity is constructed. Male sexuality was defined both in popular treatises and in sexological works as instrumental, forceful, and direct. Female generally as expressive and responsive, shaped with the traditional emphasis on female emotionality. Examples of Emily Bronte's instrumentality, forcefulness, and directness proliferate throughout many biographies, such as those by Juliet Barker, Winifred Guerin, as do examples of Branwell's expressiveness and hyper-emotionality. A contributing factor to this seeming gender imbalance may be the correlation between anima and animus. And this in turn can account for the particular writing styles of both Emily and Branwell. Branwell's contrived effusions and even his Angrian battle song have a tendency towards purple prose. Emily had a distinctly masculine manner of writing. In other words, short, terse letters, poetry depicting warfare and death, and her novel Wuthering Heights presents male characters whose masculinities occupied both extremes of what we can call a masculinity spectrum. The terms anima and animus derive from Carl Jung's theory of analytical psychology. Anima represents the male side of the personality, animus the female side. Unlike Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytical concepts, which were all heavily sexually oriented, Jung provided a more idealistic rendering of the unconscious. Questions of gender were central to Jung's system of psychoanalytical theory, especially after his break with Freud. They had an enormous bust-up and never got back together ever again. Jung distinguished between the self, constructed in transactions with the social environment, which he called the persona, and the self, which is formed in the unconscious out of repressed elements, not repression in the way Freud means, but which he called the anima. Jung favored the notion that femininity exists in all men to some degree, and to repress this results in an imbalance between a masculine anima and a female animus. As will be shown, I hope, it was Emily Bronte who tended to repress femininity, with Branwell Bronte embodying female animus. Masculinity and femininity may be interpreted as internalized sex roles. They certainly were in the 19th century, the product of what we can call social learning. Emily famously eschewed the public domain, instead preferring the domesticity of home, which is a traditionally female sphere, surrounded by her sisters. Yet anecdotes regarding her seemingly innate masculinity abound. Charlotte's biographer, Elizabeth Gaskell, describes Emily as a tall, long-armed girl whose countenance struck me full of power. According to Winifred Guerin, a biographer of all four siblings, surviving siblings, I should say, even though Emily was younger than Branwell, to Branwell's chagrin, she was taller than he and far more reckless. Charlotte's friend Ellen Nussey remembered Emily's chief delight was to roam on the moors, followed by her dogs, to whom she would whistle in masculine fashion. Daphne du Maurier, a biography of Branwell, describes Emily as a great walker who would jump the bogs and ditches without caring how wet she became. Emily domesticated a Merlin hawk. She learnt to shoot her father's pistols, and when her dog Keeper became embroiled in a fight with another dog, she seized him round the neck, separated them by force, and drove Keeper into the house, never once noticing the men standing watching, thunderstruck at the deed. Charlotte and Emily's tutor in Brussels, Monsieur Auger, please forgive me if I've pronounced that wrong, believed that Emily had a head for logic and a capability of argument unusual in a man and rare indeed in a woman. She should have been a man, a great navigator. If many believed Emily Bronte possessed numerous so-called masculine qualities, there is also a large amount of anecdotal evidence to suggest that Branwell was of a decidedly more feminine character. Joan Rees writes of Branwell as being very small for his age. He reportedly stopped growing at the age of 14. Guerin notes that Branwell had a histrionic temperament, and du Maurier describes his propensity for hysteria, collapsing for no rhyme or reason into shivers and tears. He was a delicate child, somewhat overwrought, and both supersensitive and vain. True masculinity is almost always thought to proceed from men's bodies, to be inherent in a male body or to express something about a male body. Either the body drives and directs action, or the body sets limits to action. It was Emily who drove and directed action. Branwell set limits. Where Emily could break up a dogfight without a thought for her own safety, Branwell couldn't partake of a fairground ride in the village without screaming, "Oh, my nerves, oh, my nerves." Emily would wait up at night for Branwell to come home, and he was invariably too drunk to ascend the parsonage stairs. She would carry him up to his room. The effort required of her was beyond most women's physical powers, according to the biographies. Ironically, while Branwell was the only male offspring of 6 siblings and thus favoured for fortune, he failed at everything he attempted to do in life. It was in fact Emily who was the man of the house. Augustin Trapenard notes how Emily gradually took charge of the household, but points out that she does not appear as the angel of the house, aka Coventry Patmore, in her diary papers. Due to a small sketch Emily drew of herself, showing that her posture in the parsonage, on the contrary, is that of a defiant woman. According to Guerin, Emily was already the most practical and capable member of the family by the age of 11. She remained the directing presence of the parsonage. Charlotte herself wrote of her sister, "Emily works like a horse, and she has had great difficulties to contend with, far greater than I ever had." While Emily's domestic skills were prodigious, she also tended to alternate baking with the rather undomestic occupation of pistol practice. In contrast with Emily, who was a fiercely private person, Branwell was precocious and liked to flaunt his talents. He could read a page at a glance and commit it to memory, hear a lesson and read it verbatim, and most famously, he was able to write with both hands at once. He learned both Latin and Greek effortlessly, and his father Patrick believed him to be a prodigy who might one day shine above his contemporaries at Oxford or Cambridge. Unlike his sisters, Branwell as a male was not barred by social convention from making writing a career, but he was never to fulfill his potential. Guerin writes that Branwell died at 31, completely burnt out in body and mind. Once the chief hope and admiration of his family, his failure would now be the single memorable feature of his life. The influence of the anima-animus complex, as expounded by Jung, can be seen in certain psychological tendencies such as feelings and moods. The character of a man's anima is generally thought to be shaped by his mother, but may also incorporate aspects of his sisters, aunts, and other influential female figures, symbolic archetypal images central to the tenets of Jung's psychoanalytical theory. The well-documented loss of Branwell's mother and two older sisters had a catastrophic effect on his anima, seemingly resulting in an exaggerated propensity towards the feminine. Concomitantly, the father, or equivalent patriarchal figure, is responsible for shaping a woman's animus. Patrick Bronte quickly realized the good sense of teaching Emily to fire his pistols in case the need to protect the household should ever arise. According to John Greenwood's diary, friend of Branwell, he had such unbounded confidence in his daughter Emily, knowing as he did her unparalleled intrepidity and firmness, that he resolved to learn her to shoot. The Reverend Patrick was apparently heard to exclaim, "Oh, she is a brave and noble girl. She is my right hand." When discussing the many myths surrounding the Bronte family, Lucasta Miller observes that Emily had a preference for male roles and pseudonyms, that her nickname was the Major, that Monsieur Auger praised her intellect and said that she would have been a great navigator, that villagers remember her whistling to her dogs, and that she was described rhetorically by Charlotte as stronger than a man, are all usually interpreted as comments on Emily's sexual desires, rather than on prevailing cultural assumptions regarding masculine and feminine modes of thought, writing, and social behavior. Miller points out how reductive and misleading such summations are, particularly that by Virginia Moore, who in 1936 claimed that rather than recreating a legend, her book, The Life and Eager Death of Emily Bronte, presented Emily as unexaggerated, unaltered, unobscured. Moore, in fact, claimed that Emily was a lesbian, simply because her writing was more masculine than feminine. Cecil Day-Lewis wrote with complete confidence that Emily Bronte was unconsciously frustrated at not being a man, and that her dissatisfaction with the world was a projection of this frustration. Such ideas informed much of Wade Thompson's famous essay on Wuthering Heights in the 1960s, in which he wrote that in this novel, Normal emotions are almost completely inverted. Hate replaces love, cruelty replaces kindness, and survival depends on one's ability to be tough, brutal, and rebellious. Where these and other critics like them adhere to societal gender conventions dictating acceptable behaviours, we can instead read Emily's writing as being greatly influenced by her excess of anima. Emily was not simply frustrated at not being a man. To all intents and purposes, she was the man Branwell should have been. Branwell seems to have been comparatively lacking in anima, his psychological makeup effectually setting limits to what he could achieve as would normally be considered an element of a woman's animus. Branwell's poetry and prose, exemplified in such awful lines as "You bloody bugger, ram him, jam him, and with a 40 horsepower damn him," is now largely forgotten, and quite rightly so. And he is instead remembered for his alcoholism and drug addiction. In the 19th century, the association of masculinity with reason, authority, and resolve was consolidated together with their dissociation from the feminine. Again and again, the dichotomies of energy and repose, intellect and feeling, resolution and adaptability were seen to divide humankind into two quite different elements. And of course, nobody was allowed to share with the other. While Branwell petulantly complains his doctor won't allow him stimulants, resulting in the lines I've just quoted, Emily writes, "No coward soul is mine, no trembler in the world's storm-troubled sphere." Her famous poem is indicative of her reason, authority, and resolve, while Branwell's doggerel displays the opposite: weakness, self-absorption, melodramatic emotionality. Branwell's letters were generally verbose and meandering, his poetry morose and self-pitying. "Remember me when death's dark wing has borne me far from thee, when, freed from all this suffering, my grave shall cover me." Emily's letters, the few that have survived, are perfunctory. Her diary papers are matter of fact, and her poetry is often described as powerful, elemental, and philosophical. In the Bronte Juvenilia, originally instigated by Branwell, Branwell dwells on the doomed love life of his hero Northumberland, while Emily writes of power struggles, warfare, and the assassination of her heroine AGA. When comparing the authorial style of Wuthering Heights with Branwell's unfinished novel And the Weary Are at Rest, the critic Irene Cooper Willis describes Emily as the same throughout, intensely dramatic, extraordinarily cogent. Of Branwell's piece, there is no cogency whatever in Branwell's story. There are passages of which the reader could not make head or tail at all. Again, we discern a distinct imbalance of the anima-animus complex between the two siblings. Du Maurier wrote of Branwell's manuscripts that they show no outstanding literary merit, manner and style are crude. According to Joan Rees, Branwell was a self-indulgent writer, not sufficiently critical of his own productions, definitely not. He thought they were all genius. Yet describing Emily's skill as a writer, Guerin remarks on the terseness of style, the intense economy. Charlotte wrote to her own publisher of Emily's language being at once condensed, elaborated and refined. Guerin's opinion of Branwell's work was that the tenor of all his writings is one of vacillation and weakness. Elsewhere, she calls it formless and diffuse. Emily's anima led to her writing in what was considered during the 19th century to be a masculine style, terse, condensed, refined. Branwell's animus forms a much more feminine, supposed, style, self-indulgent, vacillating, and diffuse. The signature of Ellis Bell, and this is when I wish I did have slides, so I'm very sorry. The signature of Ellis Bell is reproduced in Juliet Barker's biography of the Bronte family. It's in Emily's spiky, unembellished hand. Bronte historians Christine Alexander and Margaret Smith direct our attention to Branwell's large, elaborate forms of capital I, which would seem typical of his self-aggrandizing style. From personal handwriting to the work itself, the influence of the anima animus complex as delineated by Jung is innate. Examples of Branwell's grandiose and emotive letters are plenteous. His tactless attempts to be published in Blackwood's magazine, his obsequious letter to William Wordsworth, and his melodramatic effusions to indulgent friends such as Francis Grundy. To Blackwood's in December 1835, he wrote, "I have perhaps spoken too openly respecting the extent of my powers, but I did so because I determined to say what I believed. I know that I am not one of the wretched writers of the day. I believe," and then crossed out, "I know that I possess strength to assist you beyond some of your own contributors." The first mention of "no" is decisively underlined. But then there is a vacillation between "believe" and the second "no" later in the same sentence. Branwell audaciously finishes this letter with, "Now, sir, do not act like a commonplace person, but like a man," exhorting the addressee to prove him, the word underlined, and making the rather large claim that upon losing James Hogg as a contributor, God grant you may gain one in Patrick Branwell Bronte, as if their work was comparable. Unsurprisingly, this letter, like two he had sent before it, couched in similar terms, remained unanswered. To Wordsworth, Branwell wrote an epistle which was part plea to be read and part idolatry. "Sir, I most earnestly entreat you to read and pass your judgment upon what I have sent you, because from the day of my birth to this, I have lived among secluded hills where I could neither know what I was or what I could do. Do pardon me, sir, that I have ventured to come before one whose works I have most loved in our literature, and who most has been with me a divinity of the mind. Surely in this day, when there is not a writing poet worth a sixpence, the field must be open if a better man can step forward." According to Du Maurier, the phrase "not a writing poet worth a sixpence" condemned him in the eyes of Wordsworth, who was, of course, still a writing poet. To his friend Grundy, Branwell described his grief at being separated from Mrs. Robinson, the wife of his former employer. "I dreaded, too, the wreck of my mind and body, which, God knows, during a short life have been severely tried. 11 continuous nights of sleepless horror reduced me to almost blindness." Grundy later stated, "I believe, however, he was half mad and could not control himself," seemingly belying 19th century conceptions of gender as associating masculinity with reason, authority, and resolve. In comparison, Emily's letters are like telegrams. when a despondent Charlotte, who wrote rather long letters of her own, visits Ellen Nussey, the independent Emily is more than happy for her to prolong her stay at Hathersage. Dear Miss Ellen, if you have set your heart on Charlotte staying another week, she has our united consent. Let her make the most of the next 7 days and return stout and hearty. Love to her and you, from Anne and myself, and tell her we're all well at home. That's it. End of. She doesn't even say yours affectionately. Again, sorry for the lack of slide. It's actually yours affecty. She shortens it. And her signature is E.J. Bronte, not Emily or your friend, or just E.J. Bronte. She uses ampersands, and abbreviations, which are typical signs of brevity. The signature is impersonal and an example of Emily's instrumentality. Her diary papers are similarly concise. Writing in 1845 on the unfortunate occasion of Anne resigning as governess to the Robinsons, Branwell being dismissed for improper conduct, we have two perfunctory lines. Anne left her situation at Thorpe Green of her own accord, June 1845. Branwell left, July 1845. There is nothing to indicate the tumultuousness of the situation, simply this detached cryptic note. This episode was in fact the beginning of the end for Branwell. He never recovered from what he believed was Lydia Robinson's betrayal of him, and soon turned to drink and drugs in earnest. The contrast between the writing styles of the two siblings is even more marked when we study their poetry. Branwell's is morose and self-pitying, as these lines, sent to his friend Joseph Bentley Leyland, demonstrate. Still saw I, miserable me, long, long nights else in lonely gloom, with time-bleached locks and trembling knee, walk aidless, hopeless to my tomb. The following piece accompanied his letter to Wordsworth. Oh, how I wish I could fly far away through yonder sky, o'er those trees upon the breeze, to a paradise on high. As Du Maurier notes, a Sunday school child of 7 could have done better. One envisages Wordsworth cringing. A poem about Mrs. Robinson contains many similarly vapid lines. Oh, lady, if to me you give the power your sketch to adorn, how little of it shall I leave, save smiles that shine like morn. I'd, spelled IDE, I'd keep the hue of happy light that shines from summer skies. I'd drive the shades from smiles so bright and dry such shining eyes. Barker estimates that this was written sometime during summer 1844, when Branwell was a man of 27. At this time, his younger sister Emily was preparing once again to plunge her fictional city of Gondal into warfare. For face to face will our kindred stand, one must fight for the people's power, and one for the rights of royalty, and each be ready to give his life to work that others fall. The chance of war we cannot shun, nor would we shrink from our father's cause, nor dread death more because the hand that gives it may be dear. We must bear to see ambition rule over love, with his iron laws, must yield our blood for a stranger's sake and refuse ourselves a tear. A masculine rhyme scheme, jarring fricatives such as for face to face, combined with the energy pulsing through instances of enjambment, are all indicative of writing which utilizes anima. Excuse me. The subject is war. It's written in a male persona. It's a call to arms that personifies ambition as male, emphasizing his iron laws. Elsewhere, Emily writes in the distinctly unfeminine persona, according to 19th century gender norms, of an assassin. I saw how death could darken that triumphant eye. His red heart's blood drenched my dagger. My ear drank his dying sigh. This revel in murder was penned by a girl of 20. Such glorification of the macabre would prefigure Emily's greatest work, her tale of the Byronic anti-hero Heathcliff. The heteronormative 19th century male needed to acquire and demonstrate the essential manly qualities of energy, resolution, and independence, which would secure his masculine reputation. In life, as in her writing, Emily amply demonstrated these qualities, as does her most famous creation, Heathcliff. Dorothy Merman notes that Emily Bronte's astonishing novel and her ferociously independent character were a direct affront to 19th century notions of womanhood. Indeed, Sister Charlotte famously wrote, "Whether it is right or advisable to create things like Heathcliff, I do not know. I scarcely think it is." Wuthering Heights is a novel written in the masculine style, which delineates various instances of the masculinity spectrum, centering upon an alpha male who suffers a psychological schism due to deprivation, physical and mental, self-incurred. It is important to explore differing masculinities and their social and political contexts, for masculinity is not a monolithic concept. It is largely socially constructed. Gender cannot be considered in terms of strict dichotomies. The complex nature of Emily's novel subverts such stereotypes. One must deconstruct the monolithic view of masculinity, the unitary vision of the masculine. We must employ the plural term masculinities to denote the variability of the gendering of the biological male. The diversity of masculinities is informed by the various levels of anima and animus contained within the unconscious. Where a character like Hareton revels in manual labour and cursing, Linton is his exact opposite, epitomising the Victorian feminine trope of the invalid on the couch, unable or unwilling to expend energy upon anything except indulgence and hypochondria. The former is powered by his anima, the latter overwhelmed by his animus, yet both characters are biologically gendered as male. Masculinity is a fluid rather than an essentialist construct. We need to take into account characteristics such as speech patterns, degrees of self-control and emotional availability, forms of physicality, and other discrete actions and performances. Joseph has a coarse Northern England dialect when he speaks. Edgar Linton, however, is refined as suits his class. Yet both demonstrate acts of overt physicality. Joseph is a labourer, and the seemingly docile Edgar, when he deals Heathcliff a blow to the throat in the kitchen at the Grange. A man's character depends upon his success in stamping himself on the world. No reader of Wuthering Heights can fail to have the character of Heathcliff stamped upon their memory. With his cruelty and his authoritarian rule over the home to protect, over the Wuthering Heights household, skipped a line, Yet the domestic sphere is integral to masculinity. To establish a home, to protect it, to provide for it, to control it, and to train its young aspirants to manhood have usually been essential to a man's good standing with his peers. Heathcliff only wants control of the property and its occupants, including sacrificing his own son. His desire is for revenge upon those who have humiliated him and for his seeming otherness, i.e. his uncertain origins, and his later unexplained 2-year absence, rendering him an unknown quality in the eyes of the other protagonists. His son has been sired simply in order for Heathcliff to obtain property, and Heathcliff is horrified at the male heir he is presented with. His life is not worth a farthing, and I won't spend a farthing on him. His daughter-in-law, the second Catherine, is warned, "You must learn to avoid putting me in a passion, or I shall really murder you sometime." When gazing upon Linton and Cathy together, Heathcliff muses, "Had I been born where laws are less strict and tastes less dainty, I should treat myself to a slow vivisection of those two as an evening's amusement." The domestic sphere is integral to Heathcliff's masculinity only insofar as he can ruthlessly dominate and control it and can claim it solely as his own. Hegemonic masculinity is established either through negotiation or through power and achievement. For Heathcliff, consensual negotiation is alien. He is concerned only with power. The old Joseph, for all his peculiarities, is tolerated by Heathcliff because his particular articulation of gruff masculinity perpetuates the patriarchal order and is therefore acceptable. Hindley's masculinity is not acceptable. His gambling, alcoholism, and general degradation are an affront to Heathcliff. They are a hypocrisy in the light of the bullying he suffered at Hindley's hands when he was younger. "3 thrashings you've given me this week, my arm is black to the shoulder." Where Hindley beat down Heathcliff, Heathcliff gleefully avails himself of the opportunity to beat down Hindley in turn. The ruffian kicked and trampled on him and dashed his head repeatedly against the flags. It is only with preterhuman self-denial that Heathcliff is able to abstain from finishing him completely. A perceived subordinate construction of masculinity, such as that exhibited by Heathcliff's son Linton, is ridiculed without mercy. Joseph refers to him contemptuously as "yon dainty chap," and Heathcliff exclaims, "Haven't they reared it on snails and sour milk," calling Linton a whey-faced whining wretch. Hareton is an example of socially constructed masculinity, as epitomized in Heathcliff's threat to Hareton when Hareton is still a young boy. "Now, my bonny lad, you are mine, and we'll see if one tree won't grow as crooked as another, with the same wind to twist it." A decade later, Heathcliff declares his pleasure in what Hareton has become. He takes pride in his brutishness. "I've taught him to scorn everything extra animal as silly and weak." However, often manly bearing was taken to be the outcome of self-improvement and self-discipline. At the end of the novel, Hareton, via young Catherine, is indeed embarking on a program of self-improvement and self-discipline. His honest, warm, and intelligent nature shook off rapidly the clouds of ignorance and degradation in which it had been bred, and Catherine's sincere commendations acted as a spur to his industry. In order to appreciate the multiple articulations of masculinity populating Emily's novel, it is necessary to look at each male character individually. Masculinity is valued through the various forms of power that men can unthinkingly take for granted. The power to exert control over women, over other men, and over their own bodies. Heathcliff's control over Isabella, sister of Edgar, is absolute. I assure you a tiger or a venomous serpent could not rouse terror in me equal to that which he awakens. As for control over other men, Nellie Dean reports that Heathcliff treated the dying Linton tyrannically and wickedly. He ensures Edgar's last moments are miserable by keeping his daughter from her father's deathbed, and his command over Hareton is replete with threats of striking him to hell if he does not obey. Then there is the control Heathcliff exerts over his own body in order to be finally reunited with his soulmate, the first Cathy. He does not eat, sleep, or drink. He explains to Nellie Dean, I have a single wish, and my whole being and faculties are yearning to attain it. They have yearned towards it so long and so unwaveringly that I'm convinced it will be reached, and soon, because it has devoured my existence. I am swallowed in the anticipation of its fulfillment. Hareton begins as a primitive and ignorant boy under Heathcliff's somewhat warped tutelage, but with young Catherine's help, Hareton is able to balance his anima-animus complex in order to absorb the knowledge he needs to end the novel with a true manly bearing. The epicene Linton is overwhelmed by his animus, sucking sweets while perpetually reclining in front of the fire and demanding milk. Even Joseph, with his bluff and bluster and requisitioning of sermons, cannot be bracketed into a specific construction of masculinity. Men were nominally in overall control of the household, but they were not expected to involve themselves in the details of its domestic management. Yet when young Linton is dutifully delivered to his father upon the death of his mother Isabella, he enters an overwhelmingly male household, in which it is Joseph who acts as cook. Joseph is incensed when yon dainty chap refuses to eat his porridge. Cannot eat it, but Maester Hareton never ate naught else when he were a little un, and what were good enough for him's good enough for your eyes, rather think. Plain hardy fare does not agree with an anima-deficient male such as Linton, whereas Joseph and Hareton may represent the farmer representation of manliness, a type of homely, heavily masculine virtue associated with the world of horses, dogs, and fields. Edgar and Lockwood, the latter acting as the framing narrator of the novel, are interesting as they are both considered to be gentlemen, but there the similarity ends. In his 1852 series of lectures to the Catholic University of Ireland called The Idea of a University, Cardinal John Henry Newman stated, "It is almost a definition of a gentleman to say he is one who never inflicts pain. The true gentleman, in like manner, carefully avoids whatever may cause a jar or a jolt in the minds of those with whom he is cast. He is patient, forbearing, and resigned on philosophical principles. He submits to pain because it is inevitable, to bereavement because it is irreparable, and to death because it is his destiny." This is a rather apt description of Edgar Linton. He does all in his power to make the first Cathy happy during their very brief marriage, and when he is warned of her fits and their effects on her mental state, he behaves as placatory as possible. He is patient with Cathy's indulgence of Heathcliff, almost past endurance. Edgar submits to the pain of Cathy's death and becomes a doting father upon young Catherine. Edgar establishes a home at the Grange, which he provides for and protects, and through his role as magistrate is held in high esteem by his peers. By comparison, Lockwood is effete, almost epicene. His character reads as superficial and repressed. Where Edgar seems to display a balanced anima animus, Lockwood's anima has been repressed. For Jung, dreams are myths, the two most important manifestations of the collective unconscious. For dreams are not necessarily just wish fulfillments, they may also be criticisms of the psyche. To this end, the anima manifests itself by appearing as figures in dreams, as well as by influencing a man's interactions with women and his attitudes towards them. These dream figures are often destructive, representing elements of the psyche that have been ignored, neglected, or repressed. Lockwood has escaped to the isolation of the Grange after coldly rejecting a young lady who had begun to return his looks sweetly. On his first visit to the Heights, he hopelessly misunderstands young Catherine's relationship to the other male occupants, and his manhood is insulted when Heathcliff fails to treat him with the respect he feels he deserves as a gentleman. No, a stranger is a stranger, be he rich or poor. Heathcliff refuses to provide Lockwood with a guide back to the Grange, and then humiliates him by roaring with laughter as Lockwood lies helpless under the attack of two hairy monsters that fly at his throat. Lockwood orders them to let him out, which shows that he feels trapped, and he falls into a fit. A fate usually reserved for female protagonists in tales in the tradition of the female Gothic. Lockwood's masculinity thus undermined, he must spend the night at the Heights. Lockwood is not only trapped at Wuthering Heights by Heathcliff, but by Cathy as well, although Cathy wants to be in. Lockwood has a nightmare about Cathy's ghost, where she pleads at the window, "Let me in, let me in." Trying to rid himself of the creature, Lockwood pulled its wrist onto the broken pane and rubbed it to and fro till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. This is Cathy's attempt at returning to her childhood home. Her hold on Lockwood is a desperate attempt to get inside. Alternatively, Lockwood's nightmare could be read as an instance of his repressed anima trying to address his unconscious in an attempt to redress his quite frankly misogynistic views towards women. The power of this scene and others throughout the novel render it more horrific than contemporary readers could stomach. One contemporary review noted, "It is a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors." And some readers, modern as well, still find the work disturbing. Rather than writing in the vein of the female Gothic in the tradition of her precursor Anne Radcliffe, Emily seems rather to have followed the more visceral style of the male Gothic, exemplified by Matthew Lewis's lascivious 1796 novel, The Monk. Wade Thompson wrote of Wuthering Heights in the 1960s that life is pain, hate, and perversity. It is a tribute to Emily Bronte's uncanny poetic powers that she has deceived generations of readers into believing that they were reading a beautiful, romantic, and indeed glorious love story. Emily's novel is not about pain, hate, and perversity, nor is it a beautiful, romantic, and glorious love story. Rather, it is an intensely psychological novel about the various articulations of masculinity available to the late 18th, early 19th century male, which is when the novel is set, as represented by a young, insular female inhabiting a remote location in the north of England during the early years of Victoria's reign. Following Freud and Jung, Cooper Willis recognized this as far back as 1947. She wrote, "As to the suggestion made when Wuthering Heights was first published and repeated since, that no woman's hand could have penned Wuthering Heights, that over every page there hangs an unmistakable air of masculinity, this hardly requires to be answered nowadays with the knowledge that we have of the intermixture of so-called male and female qualities in most people." From the date of its publication, critics were shocked at Emily Bronte's novel because reviewers often applied different standards to women's writing, expecting from them decorous subject matter, delicacy, and sentimentality. Instead, in Wuthering Heights, Emily treats readers to scenes of profanity, violence, and passion, as per the previous review. The anti-hero Heathcliff was found to be quintessentially bestial, brutal, indeed monstrous, and the author assumed to be masculine, a Yorkshire farmer or a boatman. Emily herself was not the least bit perturbed by these opinions. Charlotte wrote, "If the auditor of her work, when read in manuscript, shuddered under the grinding influence of natures so relentless and implacable, of spirits so lost and fallen, if it was complained that the mere hearing of certain vivid and fearful scenes banished sleep by night and disturbed mental peace by day, Ellis Bell would wonder what was meant and suspect the complainant of affectation." Emily smiled half amused and half in scorn, apparently, at reviews of her novel. Branwell was unable to complete his novel, but still demanded to be published, seeking recognition for writings decidedly inferior to the oeuvre of his more prolific sisters. To end off with, I absolutely love this. I read it in one of the Bronte journals a number of years ago. Maria Elena Torres describes how in 2004, at a conference of Bronte enthusiasts, an imaginary Branwell addressed the delegates with the words, "Am I not a lesser echo of my brilliant and enigmatic sister Emily?" Rather fittingly, the actor speaking as Branwell was a woman. So it would seem that Emily Bronte was indeed the man Branwell should have been. Thus endeth the lesson